Who owns South Africa? Sounds like a bizarre question, doesn't it? Well, many black South Africans will say that it is mostly the white minority who seized land and property under racist apartheid-era laws. Those who lived there before the land grab were forcibly resettled far away. South Africa is attempting to address that historic injustice with a new law which was signed in January. But the Expropriation Act has faced criticism from white minority Afrikaners, leading US President Donald Trump to offer them refugee status. We'll get reaction to that from South Africa's foreign minister later. But first, DW's Diane Hawker takes a look at the law intended to resolve South Africa's land problems.
This was when Valeda Mahobe was forcibly removed from her home in Sophiatown. She was 22 at the time. At 88, she remembers what happened.
It reminds me of a very sad day, you know. As I say, we were just moved without having told where we are going to, and then we were dumped at this place.
In 1959, her family were taken against their will to Diepkloof, a township created specifically for black people by the whites-only racist apartheid government. 8 people forced from a spacious 5-room home into a 3-room house.
There was nothing, no shops, no schools, no churches, nothing.
Unfortunately, Mahobe's experience is not unique. Families were forcibly subjected to mass relocation under the Group Areas Acts from the 1950s to the 1980s. Before that, hundreds of thousands were impacted by the 1913 Natives Land Act that kept black land ownership between 7 and 13% across South Africa. The community of Sophiatown is just one of hundreds that was uprooted by apartheid land policies. Black, brown and Asian people were forcefully removed. Their homes were demolished and a whites-only neighborhood was created here. The policies kept the races segregated, but they also ensured that black and brown people were kept poor by offering substandard education, by limiting the types of jobs that black and brown people could take, and by ensuring that they were unable to build wealth through property ownership. The effect of these policies is still evident today. Millions of people live in informal settlements, unable to afford decent homes. And land ownership is still skewed heavily in favor of the white minority, despite the democratic government promising reform. White South Africans only make up about 7.3% of the population, but own half of the cities and nearly 3/4 of all farmland. South Africa's government hopes a new law, the Expropriation Act, could offer solutions. The act allows the government to identify private land that it could purchase for public projects like housing and schools. But the act also allows for the government to seize land for nil compensation in limited instances and only if a court approves. This section of the law has drawn criticism from Afrikaner groups, the white descendants of Dutch and French settlers. The demographic is also largely conservative and Christian, mirroring Donald Trump's support in the US. I believe the law is a thinly disguised plan to steal white-owned farmland, and they're lobbying Washington to intervene on their behalf. US President Trump has already signed an executive order cutting aid to South Africa. He also offered Afrikaners refugee status in the US, despite saying the country would roll back other immigration and refugee programs. Although thousands of Afrikaners have made inquiries about the process, many are reluctant to leave South Africa.
They can't just en masse sell their farms and leave. They probably can't take much of their property with them. If you look at how refugee status worldwide works, it basically means you need to grab a backpack and leave everything else behind.
Meanwhile, land activist and lawyer Tembeka Ngcukaitobi says that even though the ANC government set up a land restitution process, it left thousands of people with unresolved claims. He says South Africa won't fully recover from apartheid until the land issue has been resolved.
Black people need land, but they cannot afford it. That is the true South African crisis. And most of them cannot prove that they were victims of forced removals because the process took place so long ago and the erasure has been so deep and so sustained that memories have faded, records have disappeared.
Valeda can remember what happened, but she too doesn't have the documents to prove that her family was dispossessed. While Mahobe knows she will never get her old home back, she's hopeful that the law will bring justice to other South Africans.
And DW's Diane Hawker sat down with South Africa's Foreign Minister Ronald Lamola. Here is part of what he had to say about the diplomatic tensions between his country and US President Donald Trump.
It is interference with the sovereign state. I mean, what is in the Expropriation Act is in line with universally accepted principles of reform, of redress, which is in our constitution, and it has got sufficient safeguards in terms of the process that is followed to redress the imbalances of the past. It is an open, well-known across the globe that South Africa comes from a history of racial segregation. And the segregation means that in our country as we speak, more than 80% of the land, particularly farmland, is still owned by a white minority. And the safeguards that have been put by the law are not something unique to South Africa. In the US, they have it as eminent domain. In Britain, they have it in various laws. Germany also has an expropriation law. France, there's no country that does not have an expropriation law. Even in China, they have it. And here there is sufficient safeguards to deal with this. There's no arbitrary deprivation. So we will engage with the US when the opportunity arises. We'll continue to engage with them, but we'll also engage with the whole world to give context to this reality that every state has got an instrument that enables it to expropriate in the public interest and also for public purpose, to build bridges, to build schools, but also to ensure redress in the public interest.
Well, you mentioned that many states have this. Why do you think South Africa's law has gotten this kind of attention?
It's because of misinformation. As you're aware, misinformation to the US. That is the reason, because it's baseless, it's without facts. No one can show you facts that show that since 1994, since this government took over, there has been arbitrary deprivation of land or property by this government. It has never happened. And it's clear the Constitution provides sufficient safeguards. It will be done in line with the Constitution in terms of how we do the redress. So it is misinformation. I can lay it down to that, and maybe obviously a racist agenda, because why will the executive order only target a white minority in South Africa as the people that must be given this refugee status? Because if you want to intervene in any situation where there is a persecution, it should not be race-based. And in South Africa, the white Afrikaners in particular, they own the majority of the land. There is no persecution. They live in accordance with the Constitution, unless we're dealing with the issues of nostalgia, of wanting to revert back to apartheid.
You mentioned the executive order, and one other thing that's also mentioned in that executive order is South Africa's case against Israel at the International Court of Justice. We've also seen the US take some action against the staff at the ICJ, South Africa offering them sort of a safeguard here. To what extent do you think that the ICJ case has played a role in the issuing of that executive order?
Yeah, obviously it is in the executive order, so it means in the back minds of the authorities in Washington, it is an important issue. But we have not received any direct communication from Washington that this is the issue. We want you to either withdraw or do this about the ICJ. But if we do, we will stand our ground, because Our basis of the ICJ case is the universally accepted principles in terms of the UN Charter, in terms of the UN positions as an organ of the United Nations, the highest judicial organ of the United Nations. We have followed all those, and we have done it in line with the established convention, the Genocide Convention. So there is no basis whatsoever to malign South Africa. If you want to argue that our case has got no merits, has got no basis, and so forth, the court is there. You can intervene, argue your point, and let the judges of the ICJ decide whether there's a case or there's no case. But we have been to court now 4 times. We have succeeded. And the court said there is plausible genocide. Allowed due process to unfold. That is how the world is built, that the principle of the rule of law must be respected by everyone. And if there's any big lesson the United States has taught to the world, is the rule of law, the Magna Carta principles, universal human rights. These are the shared values between South Africa, the United States, and many countries of the world.
All right. Thank you, Minister. Thank you for your time. We appreciate that you made so much time for us today.